Well, good evening, and welcome to our Phil Lind Initiative series, The Unraveling of the Liberal Order. We're so delighted to have Anne-Marie Slaughter joining us tonight on the final event that wraps up our series. I'd now like to ask you to please turn off or silence your cell phones, and also be reminded that recording devices are prohibited. My name is Maura Quayle, and I'm the director of the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs and the Master of Public Policy and Global Affairs program here at UBC. Delighted to see a full crowd again here tonight of Lind series aficionados, and maybe some new visitors. Before we begin, we're pleased to respect the traditions of the Coast Salish First Nations, and in particular, I wish to acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Musqueam peoples who have called this area home for thousands of years and continue to do so today. The Phil Lind Initiative is a dialogue series created in 2015 from a major donation to UBC by alumnus Phil Lind, who is one of Canada's most respected media industry leaders and whose amazing strategic advice and generous support have been vital to many UBC endeavors. Phil, thank you so much. In the spirit of better understanding the politics of a country with which we share a border and close relationships, Phil established the Phil Lind Initiative series. Hosted by the UBC School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, the initiative invites prominent public scholars to UBC to engage with students, faculty, alumni, and the broader community, aiming to evoke a national conversation around issues that not only affect American society, but Canada and the world. And while at UBC, each speaker in our series also visits our Lind seminar class, which is comprised of 30 very fortunate interdisciplinary students from across the university who engage in a conversation related to the topic of the series. I'm so pleased to introduce our moderator for this evening, Carol Taylor. Carol has served a wide range of institutions over her interesting and varied career, most of you likely knowing her from her time spent as Minister of Finance for the province of British Columbia. Carol started her life as a journalist in Toronto, work that spanned 20 years and saw her hosting such shows as Canada AM, Toronto Today, and even The Carol Taylor Show. Later, she served as an independent member of the Vancouver City Council, then as the chair of CBC, at which time she resigned in order to seek the nomination of the BC Liberal Party in the 2005 provincial election, eventually being elected to the Legislative Assembly and also being named our Minister of Finance. Most recently, Carol served as Chancellor of SFU from 2011 to 2014. Thank you again, Carol, for coming this evening. And now it's my pleasure to welcome our special guest for tonight, Anne-Marie Slaughter, the President and CEO of New America, a think and action tank dedicated to renewing America in the digital age. From 2009 to 2011, she served as the Director of Policy Planning for the United States Department of State. Upon leaving the State Department, she received the Secretary's Distinguished Service Award for her work leading the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review, as well as meritorious service awards from USAID and the Supreme Allied Commander for Europe. Prior to her government service, Dr. Slaughter was the Dean of Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs from 2002 to 2009, and the J. Sinclair Armstrong Professor of International, Foreign, and Comparative Law at Harvard Law School from 1994 to 2002. Dr. Slaughter has also written or edited 8 books, including The Chessboard and the Web, unfinished business, women, men, work, family, as well as over 100 scholarly articles. As you may have seen on your way in tonight, the UBC bookstore is selling copies of the Chessboard and the Web and have paperback copies available before they're released in March 2018. We very much look forward to Dr. Slaughter's talk and to her interview with Carol Taylor, after which we'll open it up for questions from the audience. Lastly, you may tweet us your insights from the talk using the hashtag Lind18. I am now pleased to pass the spotlight over to Anne-Marie Slaughter to provide the keynote for this evening's event.
Thank you. That actually felt like, waiting in the wings for the Oscars, listening to that wonderful introduction. I'm honored to be here and particularly to be part of the Lind series. I had a marvelous 2-hour session with students as part of this seminar earlier, so I can add my gratitude to Mr. Lind. So my talk is about the unraveling of the liberal order, our topic for this evening. And I think the first question to ask is, why do we think it's unraveling? Or why are we reading a spate of analyses about its unraveling? Because one view might be that it's like NATO. NATO has been in crisis since NATO has existed. For my entire period as a scholar of international relations, the perennial article was "Whither NATO?" Every 2 years, every 3 years. And you might think, well, the liberal international order was created in 1945, and it similarly has had plenty of moments of doubt. Indeed, it never functioned nearly as well as we now imagine that it did. Right? We look back and we say, the post-1945 world order. Most of my lifetime my early years of my career during the Cold War, the UN barely functioned at all, and the other institutions, to the extent they function mostly in the West. So I think we want to start with some level setting, that it was never a perfectly functioning order. That said, it is certainly changing, and let me talk a little bit about why we would say that it's unraveling, and then talk about what I see happening. What are the factors that we use, when we think about why it's unraveling? The most the explanation that leaps readiest to mind is that we, and by we I'm going to mean Canadians, North Americans generally, Europeans, people who are pillars of this order, when we say it's unraveling, that is code for we have less power. We have less power to direct it. And there are multiple explanations for that. The realist view would be just to say the mid-20th century was an extraordinary period in which you'd had 2 major world wars, and a certain number of powers, certainly the United States, emerged as a victor with Europeans and other powers able to shape this order at an extraordinary moment with a particular constellation of nations, and that those moments don't last. And so if you think about almost 80 years on, inevitably the global landscape of power is being reconfigured, particularly with rising powers. They're actually returning powers. They're only rising powers to the United States, and I think Canada is probably a little more sensitive than the US is on this front. But of course, China and indeed Asia has dominated the world economy for centuries and centuries and centuries. Really, it is the anomaly between probably the 1700s and the mid or late 1900s that had changed. So China returning, Russia certainly returning from an era as superpower, and a really relatively small period there where it did not occupy an important role on the world stage. Beyond China and Russia, you look at a country like Iran, again, certainly a returning power. The Persian civilization, as we all remember, studying long before we even thought of a system of nation states, or powers like Turkey. Also, these are countries that have long histories of power on the global stage, who are returning in various ways. So the realist explanation would be, yes, powers shift, and as power shifts, the order itself has to shift. From a more liberal perspective, and we talked about the liberal international order, instead of just looking at centers of power, we might be more inclined to look at the rise of non-democratic states, to say that the liberal international order was premised on not only liberal democracies. Obviously, the permanent members of the Security Council were not liberal democracies when the United Nations order was set up, but that the values underlying that order, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the values of open international trade, of multilateral diplomacy, of institutions, fostering collaboration, institutionalized a set of values that were predominantly liberal democratic values, agreed to by all, but nevertheless with a clear hand on the tiller. And that, again, there's a shift there. China and Russia, but there you might also say, if you look at Iran rising, but you might look at a country like Turkey differently. You might look at other countries that have been liberal democracies, even if not always the strongest ones, who are now falling back. And look at those shifts, including the undermining of liberal democracies in Europe and in the United States, and see that more, ideology more than just straight power, as shaking the foundations of that order. So power shifts, different explanations for how. Another set of explanations would look at those institutions. And again, having studied international law for 40 years, the United Nations has never been a perfectly functioning institution. Indeed, there was the period right after it was created, and then a period in the 1990s when Russia was no longer really blocking NATO countries, and the United States was extraordinarily powerful, where we were able to work through the United Nations. But I'd say for most of its history, it has often been paralyzed. Still, you could say it is less relevant increasingly now, that we don't look first to the United Nations. You might look to regional organizations. And if you look then at the World Bank, the IMF, take the IMF, the Washington Consensus is not Washington as in your neighbor, Washington. The Washington Consensus is not is certainly not right now in global vogue. So the IMF losing support, the World Bank, lots of competitors, and new institutions rising. Obviously the Asian International Infrastructure Bank, the bank and the organization of the various BRIC countries coming together, different regional organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. That also, if you think that the liberal international order is a set of institutions, those institutions are weakening and new ones are competing. And the final factor that people point to, and here I would certainly say in the United States people point to, is the U.S. would put this, or I should say my side of the political aisle in the United States would say, a lack of leadership, that the United States is withdrawing from its role as the anchor tenant of the liberal international order and as a power that feels its responsibility for upholding, maintaining, and helping expand that order. That is the I think, fair diagnosis of President Trump, that he does not want that role. To the extent he wants the United States to lead, it is through a coercive exercise of power, or simply being the biggest, baddest guy on the block. And other nations are supposed to recognize that. He has no interest in leading through multilateral institutions of any kind. And really, we can talk about this in the question period, but there are certainly places where the United States is honestly throwing away opportunities for global leadership. But I will say that I don't think it's just President Trump. I think it actually started under President Obama. And I understand that you heard from Susan Rice, whom I admire enormously and count as a friend. On this point, she and I would heatedly disagree. In fact, I don't really know that I dare say this to her in public. But I think that when the Obama administration decided that Syria was just a problem that was too complicated to handle and we were effectively going to let people fight it out, even understanding the consequences, although, of course, when the Syria conflict first arose in March 2011, by less than a year later, we had opportunities to act before ISIS, before the huge implosion of Syria, the country, and the destabilization of the region. But when the Obama administration took the position it took, it was also saying, and President Obama did say in various ways, we can no longer be what Madeleine Albright would have called the indispensable nation. He was not convinced that we didn't do more harm than good when we tried, and some of the time we have done more harm than good. But I think that was a very different instinct than, say, Secretary Clinton or John Kerry had. And even more broadly, he didn't feel that it was our responsibility, not just in the Middle East, but, as I would put it, with that kind of suffering and that kind of abuse, it was up to us to rally a diplomatic coalition with or without UN approval and try to do something. So I think President Obama himself had a different view of U.S. leadership that for many countries meant leaving the field. And by the end of his administration, we were no longer a player in Syria. So when you look today and you say, well, it's Iran and it's Syria and it's Turkey and it's Russia, yes, that's correct, with potentially devastating implications for the entire Middle East and then Europe. But you can't pin all of that on this administration. Now, I hasten to say, in virtually every other area, I'm not comparing the two administrations. I'm very proud to have served in the Obama administration. But when it comes to the U.S. global role, that post-Cold War reflexive Richard Holbrooke, there's a problem, and it is incumbent on us as the world's most powerful nation to do something about it. That's a generational divide. And it is one that you saw passing from the Clinton administration, the Bill Clinton administration, through the George W. Bush administration. You may not have liked how the Bush administration acted, but it certainly felt that sense of responsibility to, I think, a very different sensibility, at least in parts of the Obama administration. So we've talked about why people think that the liberal international order is unraveling. The next question is, can it be restored? And for those people who think this is mostly this moment, 2016 to 2020, you will hear this is a temporary aberration, detour into insanity. You choose your own degree of intensity on that point. It's fine. The United States will elect a different president in 2020 and we'll be back. And we will lead in a different way. Secretary Clinton started with a vision of a multi-partner world rather than a multipolar world. President Obama believed in engagement, obviously engaging with countries that we disagreed with, an intense focus on diplomacy, and backed up by unconventional uses of force. So we'll lead in a different way, but we'll be back. And the system is strong enough so that it will be weakened, but it will not fail. And it's just a matter of time. I don't think that's right. And Will the international liberal world order unravel? That may be too strong. Will it change fundamentally from its 20th century instantiation? I think so. But I think so because I come at the problem from a different place, that it isn't just power shifts and the decline of some institutions and the rise of others and the presence or absence of active American leadership. The 1945 order was created to address a set of problems that are still with us, but are not necessarily the first problems now on the agenda. So in 1945, I wasn't alive, but some of the students may think I was. My children think anybody who was born before the advent of the cell phone, there's sort of no difference between that and the dinosaurs. So, but if you think about the big threats in 1945, they're the threats of war and peace. What are the threats that affect all of our lives in 1945 and then going through the Cold War? Obviously, the resurgence of war. These are generations that have lived through 2 world wars. So the most important thing is to maintain the peace. And if you don't maintain the peace, that means death and mobilization and destruction, physical destruction for ordinary citizens. Obviously less so on this side of the Atlantic. Although again, you know, had we not ended the war in the Pacific, who knows what would have happened. So just maintaining the peace is the single biggest issue on most people's minds. Then thinking about the advent of nuclear weapons and what a world full of nuclear weapons will look like. Beyond security issues, you think about economic issues, tariffs, old-fashioned on-the-border tariffs, coming back perhaps in some places, but not nearly the complicated set of economic obstacles that we face today. This was something states could do something about. You either had high tariffs or low tariffs, and states could negotiate for them. Foreign aid, the question of how you lifted countries out of poverty was primarily a function of aid from other states. And again, international institutions could build infrastructure, international institutions could help shore up economies, or indeed the imposition of state-based ideology. As we moved into the Cold War, the question of communism or capitalism often came with the question of war and peace, and again, it was something that was driven much more from the top down. So if that's your set of threats, then thinking about an order that is state-based, that has institutions, that allow states to come together and try to negotiate solutions, that upholds an idea that you can't invade another state, and you can't use force except in self-defense, that creates a trade organization, a monetary organization, a World Bank, all of that makes sense. Those threats are still there. I mean, we still could, of course, incinerate ourselves with nuclear weapons, and we look at what the politics on the Korean Peninsula, very aware of that, but it isn't just North Korea. It is quite possible, if we do not check proliferation, that we could end up in a world of 30 nuclear states, and that would be a far more dangerous world than today. So certainly nuclear weapons. War and peace, still obviously an important issue, but it's not armies marching across borders. It's much more complicated, hybrid threats in various ways. Tariffs, yes, but again, it generally clashes between domestic regulations of different kinds. I think if you asked most citizens, certainly most engaged citizens, what they worry about in the world, climate change should be one, and for a growing number of the world's citizens, that's happening now. In Norfolk, Virginia, that's happening now. In Bangladesh, that's happening now. In the various droughts and floods that we are seeing. That's happening now. That obviously, even independent of what might happen decades from now, even now, we have to be addressing those issues. Global pandemics. You know, the minute the scare recedes, we go back to our cocoons. But if you just think about Ebola a couple years ago, and suddenly people realizing what that could be and the interconnectedness that we face, if I think about threats as what am I afraid of for my children, that's high up on the list. Cybersecurity, with all of its implications in terms of our identity, our finances, our democracy, the dangers of living in a cyber-connected world and how we protect against that. I haven't even gotten to terrorism yet. So terrorism, again, very different than global, than armies marching across borders. And terrorism is just one and maybe the most extreme example of global crime. We think about trafficking in arms, in drugs, in people. We think of money laundering, even intellectual piracy. These are threats that affect all of our lives in various ways. Fundamentally, governments in the end had to show up at the negotiating table. I have talked to members of the U.S. government who say to me, you know, it's really about U.S. and China. You know, U.S. and China finally agreed, we got somewhere. I think that is dramatically overstated, but it was an instance of statecraft, and Donald Trump's decision to pull out was an act. It sounds odd to say an act of statecraft because we think of that as a sort of a complimentary term, but it was a decision made at the diplomatic level. That happens last June. The next day, already, you had Michael Bloomberg's global covenant of mayors, 7,000 mayors connected around the world. And indeed, originally starting from the C40, 40 cities, including Vancouver, who were connected through mayors, now over 100. That's a private-public, spontaneous order. Those cities stood up and said, whatever you do, the U.S. cities, whatever the federal government does, we are still bound by our own emissions targets. And then the next day, some of those cities, some governors, some university presidents, and some CEOs said, fine, the official U.S. has pulled out of this agreement, but we will negotiate with the United Nations to meet the Paris targets. That's not statecraft. That's webcraft. That is what happens when networks of cities, of corporations, and of civic groups, of citizens, come together to address global problems on their own. They can be connected to national governments, and again, in the Paris Agreement, those national governments that came together created space for what they call non-party stakeholders, which means entities that have no formal status under international law. That's why they're non-parties. They can't be party to the treaty. But they are stakeholders in the global climate, and there is room for them to make a difference. So it's ideally you have statecraft and webcraft together, but my point is, even when states are paralyzed or broken or deeply dysfunctional, you are seeing webcraft make a difference. Another good example is the Global Alliance on Vaccines and Immunization. By their own count, and it is challenged as organizations' own counts often are, but by their own count, they have immunized over 600 million children. That is a very large number. That is not a government entity. The Global Alliance on Vaccines and Immunization came together because initially of the Gates Foundation. And the Gates Foundation then working with other non-governmental organizations, the World Health Organization, so yes, you have a private actor and a public actor, other national governments and pharmaceutical companies, putting together a vast network where there is a secretariat and a core. There are pharmaceutical companies that provide the vaccines, there are NGOs in all the host nations, there are global entities like the World Health Organization. But the fact is, that's a huge result. That's a result that any number of governments or international organizations would be happy to own. All right, so now you're thinking, great, if I'm Michael Bloomberg or Bill and Melinda Gates, I too can have an impact in the world. And I understand that those are examples of individuals with a great deal of power. But there are many other examples. There are 200 global inner-city networks. And indeed, the Lind Fellow, Robert Moga, who is here, who taught the class this afternoon, works intensively with a number of those city networks from Brazil, connecting cities that are not simply in the developed world, who have a common focus on something like crime or climate or sanctuary cities or migration. But beyond cities, MIT runs an impact network that includes a number of big corporations and NGOs like Siemens or Mercy Corps that pioneers new solutions in global development, incubates them, and spreads them throughout the network. The MasterCard Center on Inclusive Growth is creating networks of entrepreneurs in developing countries, connecting them to other kinds of financial services, but also to government agencies and cities. So creating a network that lifts up entrepreneurs. There are innovation networks being created around the world, often by corporations. There are replication networks. The example I give you that I think comes most to mind, the classic example of a replication network is something like Alcoholics Anonymous, where there's a template and it just takes off. Nobody directs that. It just happens. But similarly, there are replications of revolutions. The Arab Spring, what happened in each of those countries had been incubated by an organization that looked at how Milosevic was overthrown in Serbia and spread that template to groups of young insurgents or revolutionaries in other countries. So these networks are coming from corporations, from cities, from civic groups, and that order, messy, ungoverned, disorganized, is actually rising. So if that's what the new world order looks like, I just have a couple of questions as to how to think about it. One, what does it mean for ordinary citizens? What does it mean for all of you? Can anyone engage in webcraft? And I just acknowledge that obviously if you have $1 billion in a large foundation and you've been the mayor of New York, probably easier. But honestly, on any issue you can think of, there will be a non-governmental network, a university network, a network that in turn can be connected to a corporate network and a civic or urban network. Any group of people, if you map who are you connected to and who are you connected to on a particular issue who can make a difference, it is then possible to connect that group, that network, that node of a network to another one. And, if you think back to the Landmines Treaty or the International Criminal Court Treaty, both of those treaties were fundamentally brought about by non-governmental organizations working with governments. Today, there are countless more examples. So this is a citizen-powered type of global order that is not enough. We still need states, but is absolutely open, at least to anyone, as all of you, who live in a consequential city. Because I think in many ways cities and the civic groups and corporate groups that live in cities will drive this. Will it be a liberal order? That's the next question. The answer to that depends on whether the networks that rise are facilitated by open societies or are allowed in closed societies. I would argue that the most effective networks depend on open societies. And for a very simple reason. To take a brief detour, if you want to get a job, do not ask your friends and family. Ask your acquaintances. Why? Because your friends and family, they're your friends and family. They know everything you know. So if they know about a job opening, you already know about it. It's not going to help. What you need to actually accomplish your goal is input from the outside, your acquaintances, the people you know, but you don't know so well that you know all their networks. They bring something new into your world, and you profit from it. That basic logic, if you expand it, says that countries or cities or groups of people who remain more open to what is unfamiliar will get more of whatever they need, whether that is resources or contacts or the ability to make additional connections. That means that open societies should have stronger networks, and those networks, conversely, should be more able to achieve their aims. In theory, it is also possible, and we will see it, to control the extent to which your people can network and to have much more directed networks in countries that are not open. And if I think about a web order that arises from corporations and cities and citizens, it is not guaranteed that it will be able to maintain the open world that is a hallmark of a liberal world order, but there's certainly a good fighting chance. And finally, how do you bring that web order together with the chessboard order? The liberal international order may be weakening, but it's not disappearing. And we desperately still need governments. The view of the world as a chessboard and a web have to be seen both together. How do we put them together in ways that give us maximum ability to confront global problems, where, like the Paris Agreement, where states understand the room for a web, bottom-up, people-driven order, but still also the room for statecraft. We will have to think of those together. Some states are well ahead here. China has a very deliberate network strategy. China's strategy of one belt, one road, if you read the Chinese, or read the analyses by Chinese scholars, they talk about building networks through Southeast, Central Asia, all the way to Europe. That building those networks, the physical infrastructure, is the platform for those human networks that will make China strong. The European Union, unfortunately, this strategy came out the day after Brexit, so nobody read it. But the European Union global strategy says that the European Union will be, quote, an agenda shaper, a connector, a coordinator, and a facilitator within a networked world. That is how it will exercise power. And indeed, the Liberal Party, the Canadian Liberal Party, had a global network strategy before winning this last election, in which it said, quote, influence is gained through connectedness because networks define how the world works today. And the strategy assumed deep collaboration with web actors. So it is possible then and ideal to take governments and still have the statecraft world, but make room for the web world and put the two together. Canada can play a role through that kind of a strategy, the strategy articulated of deliberately building civic, corporate, and urban networks. But I want to end by saying I think Canada has a larger role to play here, because in many ways Canada has been way ahead of other countries in understanding the international system as a system of people as well as of states. When I was still an international lawyer in the late 1990s and the early aughts, Canada was well ahead of other countries in working with Japan to pioneer the idea of human security. And those relatively bright days after the Cold War, where it looked like the liberal order was working and there were ways of lifting up human concerns, Canadian thinkers, the Canadian government, pushed hard, again with the Japanese and others, to say the world is not just about state security, it's also about human security. And Canada hosted the International Convention on State Sovereignty that came up with the idea of the responsibility to protect, an idea that says when a state is committing genocide or atrocities, crimes against humanity, against its own citizens, we must intervene. So Canada has had a role in thinking about what a web world looks like as well as a state world. And Canada, as an immigrant country, as an open country, and as a state that can operate quite effectively as a medium power among larger powers, and I think as a trusted power, can operate very effectively in the chessboard world, but equally importantly can recognize the potential of the web world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, so much for that thoughtful analysis of the chessboard and the web. I want to pull on a few of the threads that you brought up during your speaking to us. I noticed that just before the last Davos, there was a paper released, an official paper, that said we're moving into a time of the charismatic strongman leadership around the world. Do you agree with that?
The man part, yeah. You know, I think this is a time of great turbulence, and the turbulence of globalization, the turbulence of technology, the turbulence of enormous demographic change. And again, I'll speak more from the U.S. perspective, but you know, by 2050, to be American will no longer be to be white. In other words, the default identity will be changed. These are very big changes, and in those circumstances, you always get a turn to strong men, and here it could be a strong woman, but this crop are all men. But this notion of somebody will restore order, will maintain order, will return to an earlier time. So I don't know about charismatic, but I do think it is not surprising that we're seeing support for people who promise that they alone can save the nation.
In the midst of all the turbulence,
yes.
This is how we find order. You talked about some people perceiving the withdrawal of the United States from various global situations. And I think if you listen to some of President Trump's words, you would believe him to be an isolationist, pulling back, make America great. And yet when you look at the countries that he is either involved or interfering with, you know, you have Iran, Syria, you certainly have Israel, North Korea, China, Russia. So it's almost the opposite of the feeling of pulling away from everybody else. How do you see that?
Yeah, I don't think he's an isolationist, and actually I don't think he knew or cared that America first referred to the isolationist groups of the 1930s. I remember when he first announced it, and many of my colleagues were like, oh my God, how could he possibly, America first? That's Charles Lindbergh, that's support for Nazis. He didn't know or care, and again, I think he actually tapped into the notion that it's not America alone. It's that America's been being screwed, and I'm going to change that, which is not true, although it certainly is true that as power adjusts, the American willingness to be the hegemon, right, to pay a price, a bigger price than other nations, to be the guarantor of that order and to hold the world's reserve currency has diminished. But I think his view is that we should be in the world. We should be deeply respected and bowed to in the world. And that's not isolationism, that's bullyism.
Is it going to work?
No. No.
If you were back then in your role as Director of Policy Planning, the State Department, what advice would you give this president? that you can say in public?
Where do you start? I'm trying to think whether I would actually be in my role and try to frame the advice in a way that might get listened to, because the first thing I would say is this is not a president who listens, so there's no point in giving him advice. I think the other way in which he's clearly not an isolationist, he's a global businessman, and in many ways he thinks of the presidency as what is, good for Trump's business is good for the country, is good for the world. And so I might point out that this kind of bullying and brinksmanship is likely to lead many other countries to start bypassing the United States. And again, we saw some of this even in the Obama administration. When you keep imposing sanctions through banks, sooner or later people say, I know how to do this, I just won't bank through, I will not use the US banking system, I'll go around it. And in a globally connected world, you can't avoid us completely, but it's easier to do that. So I would probably suggest to him that as I said, kind of bullying and brinksmanship and threatening other countries is ultimately bad for business.
And so many fronts.
But I wouldn't expect him to listen.
So many fronts at once as well.
Yeah. There is no strategy here. The way in which we've withheld from, pulled off the world stage, there's no strategy whatsoever. There is a national security strategy, but that is not driving anything. It's just response and kind of outrage and, whatever the day brings.
So if we take an example of North Korea, and we have the chessboard and we have the web notion of how you might influence change, what should be done?
Yeah. So here I'm actually going to say something you might not expect. I will say that, again, I have a lot of respect for General Mattis, a lot of respect for H.R. McMaster, and some of the people who've been working on the national security side. They came in saying, I think, exactly what Secretary Clinton would have said had she been elected president, which is our strategy with North Korea was not working. We had been doing the same thing since 1994 and paying for the same North Korean concessions pretty much once every 5 years. And they were building a nuclear arsenal while we were supposedly having these negotiations, and then they would pull out, and then we'd do anything we could to get them back to the table, and then they'd make another bomb and do the same thing. So the idea that we needed to be much, much tougher, I think was right. And I think Secretary Clinton would have called for a review and tried to change the policy and make it much tougher, and to lean on China very hard. And so there's a fair amount of what this administration has done in terms of tightening sanctions, working more closely with allies, trying to put pressure on China, that I think is the right approach. It's just that they can't control the president himself. Insulting the leader in, Little Rocket Man, that kind of thing simply makes us look ridiculous and actually strengthens the power of the North Korean leadership. I don't have a solution. I do not think there is a military solution. I think it is dangerous to pretend that there is. But either we're going to accept in some way that this is a nuclear power and try then through reunification long-term, through some other kind of regional strategy to encourage North Korea as a nuclear power to denuclearize. That's the only way I can see it evolving. So I would not lay all this at his feet.
On a perhaps easier topic, we'd appreciate advice in Canada how we can relate to the President and the United States this time. Do you have any advice for us?
This is surreal. know. I mean, honestly, as Canada, I mean, this is why I mean the backfires. I think Canada has an important intellectual role to play and an important diplomatic role to play as a power that is very well positioned with other NATO powers, but also other powers through the Commonwealth, other powers in terms of as Canada's own population changes, obviously strong ties in Asia and other parts of the world. I would be building diplomatic and economic networks. I would recognize that Canada does remain a critical interlocutor for the United States when the United States is either talking or listening. So there are these moments that I think where you still can get through in ways that other countries can't. And I think Justin Trudeau's meeting went very well. NAFTA, I think Canada has some real potential leverage, because that's something that certainly the people around President Trump want to see change in some way. I'm skeptical that it will, but as long as Canada holds some of the cards, I would use those. But I would not spend a lot of time trying to accomplish goals with the United States.
That's depressing. Well, we seem to be a little bit confused. I mean, sometimes we think we'll play nice, and then sometimes we think, well, we better be a tough guy too. I'm seeing this in some in the NAFTA negotiations and some of the court cases we're bringing, but then also playing nice. So I don't think we really know what strategy to use here.
I would be talking to the Mexicans as much as I could. Obviously, the yes. Mexicans are going to have their own elections, but honestly, yeah, I think it's hard to blame a government for not knowing how to address a government that is behaving as erratically as ours is, but. And there, I do think this will not last forever. I may not think that the liberal order and U.S. leadership are going to be automatically restored, but I do not think this is going to be situation normal. But I think, so I would think either for when Congress changes or when the White House changes, and that doesn't just mean whether a Democrat wins, it just means whether someone sane wins. And then I would, in that regard, I would be building relationships with other countries. And I'm not sure there is a negotiating strategy, tough or not, that one could follow.
I think I heard you say, as you were speaking, that 2020 there'll be a different president.
I believe that there will be a different president in 2020.
We'll remember.
I did not specify which party. I just believe there will be a different president by 2020.
Now, your career has had so many interesting twists and turns and tremendous opportunities. And in the Obama administration, you were the first woman who was director of policy planning, a tremendous position for you to have had. When you went from the world of academics, which, you know, you had been writing books and theses and articles, and then went inside politics, what was the biggest shock for you?
The biggest shock. So I've often said the biggest difference was that in academia, you are rewarded for coming up with big ideas with your name on them, right? So to succeed in academia, you want Anne-Marie Slaughter, network theory, and preferably sort of thinking that begins and ends with me, which is certainly not true, but that's what you want people to think. In Washington, you want to take big ideas and chop them into very little ideas, and then convince other people they thought of them. Right? So the worst thing you can do is to march in and go, I've got a great idea. Here, let's overhaul the X, right? You are written off instantly. So I had a lot of culture change. I think the shock was, the biggest shock was that Washington's run by 32-year-olds, right? Indeed, many capitals are. So you come in being a principal from the outside, and I saw partners in law firms and CEOs, and I'd been a dean, and you come in and you're used to having, a certain amount of stature on the outside, and you come in, and of course you have lots of formal relationships, although most of Washington runs on you can't meet with anybody above you or below you, so you have to stick to your level. But really, the people who run the city are the gatekeepers. And I had the same thing. You have young people who are indispensable to you, but they work round the clock, but they're the people who you absolutely have to cultivate, or your people have to cultivate their people, but it's really even more direct than that if you want access. And I found that was a shock. I think in the outside world, there's sort of a straight, you rise and you have more power. That is not necessarily true, I think, in D.C., at least for me. I had to really learn how to navigate that system.
And you did? And you had
Well,
great
I like
influence.
young people. I'd been a professor for a long time. I didn't realize that some of my former students would, be in that position. But I have to say I loved working for Secretary Clinton. I loved working for somebody I knew was truly committed to a set of principles, and she wanted to elevate development. She wanted to make development as important as diplomacy as part of our foreign policy. And I thought, exactly as I've been talking now, development is the world of people, diplomacy more the world of states. I wouldn't have formulated it as the chessboard and the web at that time, but I believed deeply in what we were doing. It is too political a town for me to want to live there. I want the world of ideas, and I also love the world like a city like this one, where you have multiple different sectors coinciding, where you have arts and finance and academia and NGOs. Washington is, there's the Oval Office, and everything is measured by how close you are to it. And that gets a little boring.
And then you left after 2 years.
I did.
Was that a hard decision?
The actual decision to leave at that point was not a hard decision. As I wrote, my son needed both parents on deck. My husband was really being a spectacular father, but my elder son really just needed both parents on deck. And that, in the end, didn't feel really like a choice. It felt like this is what I have to do now. In many ways, the harder choice was not putting my name back in 2012 and decide, because, you come home, and I came home in 2011, and by the time of the 2012 election, everything was fine at home. But that was the choice I made, not to try to go back, because I realized I would completely miss the last 4 years my children were at home. And that was a hard
What kind
decision.
of response did you get from either feminists or other people who saw you as the role model? And did you get the sense that they felt you'd let them down?
Yeah, I got yes, that I'd let them down, but even more fundamentally that I'd lost IQ points, I'd lost ambition, I just wasn't that important a person anymore. I mean, when I came out of the State Department, if I said to somebody, well, I'm back at Princeton because otherwise I will lose my tenure, because you have a 2-year public service leave, that was fine. Everybody kept talking, everybody kept treating me as a player. If I said, and even then I was starting to sort of try that out, I would say, well, I'm home, our kids are just starting high school, I don't want to miss this critical period. I could just see myself sinking in the estimation of the person I was talking to, man or woman. And many of the women who had been my cohort, yes, essentially the kind of, I guess she's not the person I thought she was. And I thought that I had achieved enough and that I was so evidently committed to a career that surely I would be able to say that and people would actually respect it and take it in. But instead, I discovered what millions and millions of women have discovered, is that suddenly then you're not a player.
And you were brave enough to say out loud, you can't have it all, to women.
Well, that is not what I meant to say. That is definitely what many people heard, although I think that what I was saying was this is still much, much, much harder than we are led to believe, including myself. If you had told me in 2009, you will have a chance to be promoted to, and they're only good jobs from assistant secretary up, they're all good. You will have a chance to be promoted as the first woman of a higher position, and you will go home to your family, I'd have said, you do not know who you are talking to. I'm sorry, that will not happen. And yet it did happen. And when it did happen, I thought a couple of things. One, I thought, wait a minute, I am just as talented and ambitious as you might have thought I was before. I might not be, but if you thought I was. But I've done what I think is the right thing to do, which is I brought a child into this world, and these are issues that are going to affect the rest of his life. And I'm not dropping out. I'm just, and in fact, I went back to being a full-time tenured professor, so I wasn't slouching. But I'm going to put this first for a while. And when that happened, I suddenly looked at the millions of women not millions that I knew, but the hundreds I knew who had made that choice, and I had essentially thought they just couldn't cut it, and I thought I was wrong. But then what I was really trying to say is, my God, I had every advantage. I had a great boss. I had a lot of autonomy. I was high up, and even I had to make this choice. The workforce is still not set up this way. Social attitudes are not set up this way. We have a long way to go before women and men have the same choices. So it really wasn't why women can't have it all. It was why women still can't have it all. Here are the changes we still need to make, and it was me saying I was wrong to assume that it was just a matter of a woman's ambition. It's a matter of ambition and circumstance and a lot of barriers that we do not impose on men.
Have your thoughts or opinions changed since the time that you wrote that article?
Well, not on that particular point. I think we've got still a long way to go. What has really changed is I spent 3 years writing a book and came out in a place, again, I never expected I would come out, which is to say the biggest mistake we've made in liberating women, and I'm old enough, it was women's lib, and I do believe it was a liberation. When I look at the world my mother was born into and the world I was born into in 1958, but the world that changed dramatically in the 1960s and 1970s, I was liberated to be the full human being in pursuit of a career and of passions that I was able to. But that in letting women do the things their fathers did, we systematically devalued the work our mothers did. And that was a real mistake. That actually care and the care of others and the investment in your children, in your parents, in your siblings and spouses, and it can be a biological or a created family, our society would not exist without that investment. And so before I wrote this book, I'd have told you my father's a lawyer and my mother's an artist. And I would have been really insistent that my mother's a professional artist. She is. She's had a 40-year retrospective. She's a really talented artist. I'd have never said she was a homemaker. And now I think I wouldn't be here but for what she did. And her investment in our family has held our family together. My father, too, he's a great dad. But really, it was her time and energy, and that's the platform on which all of our success is built. And so what I believe now is we should be valuing women and men for investing in care as much as in career, and that a real, truly equal society would say to men as well as to women, yeah, we want to empower you to live up to your full potential as a worker of some kind, but we also want to value the work and the love and the energy you put into others.
When you read your book, Unfinished Business, you realize how much empathy you have for men and the position they've been put in, and our expectations for men, and how we also have to get our heads around that as well.
We do. I do. No, that was another thing I changed. But actually, it's because men wrote to me after my Atlantic article and said, you think I designed this world, but I actually would much rather be able to spend more time with my children. That is not allowed me at all, right? I'm the breadwinner. That is the role society's given me. And I have even less choice than a woman in the workplace, because if I take time out, not only am I not committed to my career, and women have that problem too, but I'm less of a man. And so I have come to see it that way, although I have to say, both my children, I have an actor and a musician, 2 sons, and their life strategy seems to be to marry well. So I sometimes think that I may have, this may have gone too full circle, but no, I think there are so many men who would make different choices if we didn't have a tightly constructed notion of masculinity and their fear that if they made those choices, they would be seen as less of a man, less attractive to the opposite sex, and less able to pursue their careers.
Now, I know that Anne-Marie likes especially the Q&A section of the evening, and so I invite anyone. It's hard with the lights for me to see where hands are, but I'm sure.
There we go.
Thank you.
There's a whole audience out there.
We have mics that will come around to you, so if someone is interested in asking Anne-Marie a direct question, please raise your hand and we'll get you a microphone. Yes, just over here.
Okay, stand up. Okay. So first of all, I would like to thank you for this very interesting session. Okay, so my question is, with the rise of Trump and the failure of the Democratic Party in 2016, what is the future role of left-wing populism, and specifically Bernie Sanders? And can this sort of movement help revitalize the order in the modern era?
That's a great question. Well, I think Bernie Sanders is likely to run again, so we'll see, but I think he will. Whether he does or not, the Democratic primaries will be a 3-way fight between the Bernie Warren folks, the Obama folks, and the next generation of Clinton folks. And I'm quite worried that in that 3-way fight, ideas will not get paid enough attention to. In other words, it'll be all about the person, not the ideas. And of course, that's a dangerous situation for an opposition party to be in. I think the left-wing progressivism, I actually believe in the old-fashioned definition of progressivism, which is you believe in progress. You can do that on the right and the left, actually, and that it is not just this one wing of the Democratic Party. But I think what is important, and you are seeing it on the Republican side too, is just a challenge to the establishment. What I see on both sides, and you saw it in France, you see it in many places, was this system is not working. This system is broken. American democracy is deeply broken. You do not have the ability as a voter to say, I'm going to organize, I'm going to elect somebody, and the person I'm going to elect is actually going to be responsive to my views. And if you can't do that, that's a problem. You don't have a liberal democracy. And I think so, you know, if you think about Bernie's supporters on trade, on things like education, on just a sense that they were saying the system is rigged, just as much as the Trump voters were saying the system is rigged. And but the task for those of us who believe deeply that we have got to tackle these problems is not to make it about people. It can't be about Bernie or Liz Warren or others versus other parts of the Democratic Party. It has to be, what is our agenda? And it can't be just more of the same, you know, elect us and we'll do this. It has to be how are we going to have jobs in a world of artificial intelligence? How are we going to give people lifelong education so they can adapt to changing circumstance? How are we going to strengthen families when both, if they're 2 parents or 1 parent or 3 parents, however many people are responsible for children and elders, that they can do that they can actually take care of those they love and earn a living. And so what I like the fact there's ferment. I am worried that there's that ferment doesn't doesn't necessarily push in the direction of big new ideas.
And it can't be just anti-Trump.
No, definitely not. It has got to be, there's good reason that people feel frustrated and frightened, and we must address that.
Another question. Just over here.
I don't know how you can see.
I've got a very short question to ask you, perhaps not a simple one, but I just want to preface it by asking you to entertain a kind of counter-historical premise that after the assassinations of the 1960s, John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King, miraculously, the United States had put into effect gun control, serious gun control, that would have prevented many of the recent tragedies we've all heard about. And that in other countries that the US traditionally distrusts, particularly Russia, North Korea, and Iran, school shootings there had been routine. You know, that guns were out of control in these countries, and it was very, very common for small children or bigger children to be shot. Well, of course, many people in the United States, including yourself, any card-carrying liberal, Democrat, rational person would say, why should we ever trust these countries? These are countries that allow the slaughter routinely of their own children. Well, of course, it didn't happen in those countries. It happened in your country. And statecraft seems to have failed, at least at the federal level. I mean, every single time there's an outrage in a school, the same pieties are uttered, and absolutely nothing happens. So statecraft has been a failure there. So if you had to design a webcraft assault, unfortunate choice of terms, but if you had to arrange or imagine some kind of webcraft campaign that would really bring about, or at least stand a better chance of bringing about change in the gun laws in the United States, how would that be? What kind of shape or campaign could you envisage?
Neither short nor simple. Hard question, thank you. So it's happening. I think that the starting point is that the slaughter of children is a manifestation of the fundamental brokenness of our political system. Right? It is not about what the American median voter wants. The American median voter wants a ban on assault rifles, for starters, and we can take it from there. The Americans probably will always have more guns than other countries, than the Europeans. As a frontier country, as a hunting country, we're never going to look like Europe in that regard, but there's a long way between hunting rifles and assault rifles, but this is the control of a very small interest group. I mean, the iron law of politics is that small, concentrated groups win out over large, diffuse groups. And in a situation where the NRA can reliably control a group of voters, because it's more about that than it is even about campaign contributions, in a broken political system, that's where you have to start. It is starting partly because it used to be that the NRA had support with Democrats and Republicans. They control swing voters on both sides of the aisle. That's no longer true. They're controlling swing voters almost entirely on the Republican side of the aisle, which means Democrats no longer feel that they have to sell out to them. And to your point about a web strategy, Mayor Bloomberg's putting that into place. His gradual building, starting in cities and starting with police, right? This is where you have an important group in cities saying we have to have gun control, and then spreading that from city to city. Okay, but then you say, yeah, but the cities are already blue, so what difference does that make? The next step is suburban mothers. And on this, and fathers, because it's preposterous to claim that it's just mothers who care. But on this issue, and it is also, you're seeing the sort of web dimension of these students coming out and being connected and being visible. On this issue, you're going to start to see critical Republican swing voters who are going to choose children over guns. And it's going to take a while, and it's going to take the fixing of our democracy in larger ways. But I genuinely do believe that because of the way the politics are changing, and because of the continuation of this, we are starting to take hold. It is a daily, weekly reminder of the insanity we are living in.
Question from someone in the back.
Okay.
Way in the back.
Hi.
Hi.
First of all, thank you for being here. You're such an inspiration to me, and it's really exciting to see you talk.
Thank you.
My question is about how do you think the rise of the alt-right and its role and being able to be such an international movement due to the internet impacts the way that states will interact with webcraft and people interact with webcraft in terms of I don't want to use activism because it's a negative word, but like activism on the right.
So it is worth noting that, you know, the rise of fascism in the 30s spread rapidly from country to country without the internet. So you don't need, and frankly, so too on the left, communist parties in Western Europe, parts of the parties supported by the Soviet Union. So the internet makes it worse, but there I do think it's a matter of degree more than of kind. We've had, what's happening is that these parties are springing up responding to similar circumstances and then, or perceived circumstances, loss of control, blaming it on immigrants, economic hardship in various ways. Although again, it's rarely the poorest of the society. It's people who have something but have generally lost status. They are then encouraged by what's happening in other countries. So if I remember after Brexit, Donald Trump, who was then a candidate, saying, see, they could do it, we could do it too. And then, of course, the minute Trump was elected, then other parties say, we can do it too. That happens whether or not you have the internet. But from the webcraft perspective, the best you can do is to understand that the technology is never going to cut only one way. You can't use connectedness for a good cause and not also have it be used for a bad cause. You can't, as I said, the people in the world who use networks very, very effectively are global criminals. And that's not going to change. The best you can do is to try to either steal the same tactics to mobilize people for resistance and for counter positions, or at least develop very effective strategies of connection. And that's really what I've been talking about, is whom do you connect, how do you connect them? For instance, if I were thinking on the left, or simply to restore American politics, I would say what we need is a network that is composed of many small nodes, because we need to rebuild trust, and you have to rebuild trust in relatively small groups, small communities, neighborhoods, then medium-sized towns, places that people can actually come together and once again see each other as humans, not as demons. And then as you build, you connect those relatively small nodes. So if I were developing activist groups for a cause I believe in, I would use the internet, and specifically the design of networks, digitally enabled but also physical, in a way that I hope would be stronger than the opposition. But you can't shut it down on one side without shutting it down on the other. And so you have to just accept that, of course, you can, there's one exception, you can prevent groups that are actively advocating violence. And I think that has been the line that we've drawn in the United States, and that's a line I think we can draw globally too.
Dr. Slaughter, thank you for this
my
evening.